This is Behind the Mic.
Welcome to a bonus episode of Behind the Mic, as today, Thursday the 31st of July, marks the end of the second quarter of 2025, which means that stats from the RAJAR figures for radio are out. I'm Tom Sevens, and today we are unpacking the latest RAJAR figures from the second quarter of 2025, and there is a lot to talk about. This quarter marks a significant milestone for commercial radio, as it has captured its highest ever share of UK listening at 55.7%, surpassing the BBC's 42.1% share. That translates to 39.5 million weekly listeners tuning into commercial stations, a whopping 8.4 million more than the BBC radio. Overall, 86% of UK adults, roughly 50 million people, listen to the radio weekly, showing that despite streaming growth, radio remains hugely relevant. The story of these numbers? Well, a massive digital transformation. Online listening now accounts for 29.3% of the radio listening, surpassing AM and FM analogues, which sits at around about 26.6%. Smart speaker usage has reached a record 18.4% overall, rising to 22.4% for commercial radio, occupying AM and FM for commercial stations at 20.9%. There's no denying that smart speakers, such as Alexa and Google Home, are changing how we tune into radio. Global continues to dominate with 29 million weekly listeners across its brands, with a record 27.7% market share. However, please do remember that this accounts for all the stations that Global own, not just one. Also note that there are a lot more commercial stations than BBC ones, so this is not unusual for their listening to be higher. But in a minute we'll look at how many numbers there are for listening on BBC Sounds. Their flagship station, Heart, remains the biggest commercial radio brand. This means in total for all of the stations that Heart have. That includes their decade shows, their dance shows, music and love. It comes to a total of 13 million listeners. Heart's main station, Heart, has got around 6.5 million weekly listeners. Capital and Smooth have also held in firm at high reach levels. Meanwhile, Bureau Media is thriving digitally. Absolute Radio is now the most listened to digitally only commercial station at 2.2 million weekly listeners. Other highlights: Boom Radio is up 14% on the year to year, hitting 711,000 people, while decade stations like Heart 80s, Planet Rock and Radio X Noughties saw strong rises. On the BBC side, Radio 2 still leads the single most listened to radio station with 12.6 million, though it saw its lowest figures in years. However, this has risen slightly since the last quarter. Other BBC networks: Radio 4 hits 9.2 million, Radio 5 Live grew to 5.5 million, and Greg James on Radio 1 Breakfast fell off slightly to 4.15 million from 4.4. Vernon K remains the home to the most listened to individual programme in the UK, drawing in 6.6 million each week. A surge in podcasts continued, as 16.3 million UK adults now listen to podcasts weekly, a new record. BBC Sounds logged the staggering 257 million on-demand plays in the last quarter. That includes radio shows, podcasts and radio stations. 8 of the top 10 podcast titles are coming in for Radio 4. The director, Jonathan Wall, said another standout quarter. Listening habits continue to evolve. Let us dig into the standout digital spin-off performance across nostalgia-driven brands. Boom Radio has 711,000 listeners, that's plus 14% on the year to year. Heart Dance has broken 1 million weekly listeners for the first time. Greatest Hits Radio 70s and 80s debuted strongly with 333,000 and 500,000 respectively. Heart 80s climbs to 1.9 million weekly listeners, and Smooth 80s is up to 664,000 listeners, though Absolute 80s dipped to 1.4 million. On 90s and Noughties stations, Heart Noughties is up to 1.3 million and Absolute's 90s is down. Radio X Noughties has surged 50% to 157,000 listens per week. Planet Rock is at 1.1 million, that's an 8% increase. Kiss Extra is on 240,000 listens, that's plus 14.8%. Mellow Magic is at 470,000 listeners per week, that's up 6%. It's not all national. Local and specific service made waves. Original 106 posted its best ever figures with over 100,000 listeners. Sunrise Radio remains the top Asian commercial brand nationally, and in London, Sunrise Smooth is up 33% to 39,000 listeners. Lycra Radio has recorded its highest ever reach in years, only 5,000 listeners behind Sunrise. Centred Force 883 surges around 60% to 153,000 in London. Meanwhile, Me Soul contrasted with a dip of 30% to 129,000 listeners. And of course, Fixed Radio, not a RAJAR measure, has hit 724,856 weekly listeners across the UK, with 27.9 hours of listening per week and 42% of year-on-year growth. The CEO, Lewis Timpany, called it a staggering audience growth and personal recommendations. Here's what the industry leaders had to say about the record quarter. Matt Python from Radio Centre said this record is a testament to innovation and investment. Listeners can easily access their favourite stations from any platform. Ashley Torborn-King, the CBE of Global, said he's delighted to see Heart extended its lead, a considerable achievement. Simon Buer said a third of our listening is now online, in an app or via their smart speaker. Our commitment to excellence remains strong as ever in our 150th year. Phil Riley from Boom Radio said, our listening tune is for almost 16 hours a week. That's a loyalty, and that is down to our presenters. So what are we seeing here? First, radio is anything but dying. It's actually coming back. Second, commercial radio has hardened the shift brilliantly, well ahead of the BBC in driven smart speakers and online uptakes. Third, niche and decade brands are representing deeply, especially with older listeners and fans. But it's not all smooth sailing. Some BBC stations and local outlets are fearing pressure on reach and programming. And as online listening approaching a third of all listeners' hours, competition with streaming platforms is only going to intensify. Looking ahead, expect more tailored launches, more spin-offs, and a continued fight for digital share. And don't be surprised to see headline listener shifts even further towards commercial and podcast first habits. That's your full second quarter 2025 RAJAR breakdown here on Behind the Mics. Thanks for listening, and remember that tomorrow you'll be able to hear episode 5 of Behind the Mic. Until then, make sure you listen to your favourite radio station to support their listening levels for the next quarter.
This is Behind the Mic.